what are the modes or tools that you use in order to counter this notion of the Somya? Because I feel like it's quite entrenched in how the Somya is thought of in literature or cinema. So any methodologies that you have kind of adopted as a way to counter the romantic anarchist notion of the Somya?
I think we do. I mean, one of the methods that we really like to think with is one of our friends kind of mentions Jessica Kajrek, but also, I mean, other people like Ye Sito and all, who kind of talk about indisciplinarity as a form. And indisciplinarity is something that cuts against. I mean, it comes from the basic idea that it's not just interdisciplinarity where you're moving across disciplines. It's not just transdisciplinary, which could also mean similar things, but indisciplinarity simply comes from the word of being indisciplined, that you're really not actually tethered. And even while moving across disciplines or disciplinary work, that you're cutting across in ways uh, that could not be seen as traditional, and so on and so forth. So it really comes from the word or act of being indisciplined. It's as simple a phrase as that. And I think the way in which, I think a lot of the ways in which we think about uh, think about uh, Zomia sort of non-romantic stature is to actually often write about their histories and write about the histories of these places. That kind of, I mean, it's very often in the granular details. I don't like to often talk about grandiose methods, but I think like I'm very comfortable often talking in terms of terms of talking about in the specific modes and details. So I think the way in which we write histories of that place, and the way in which we remain uh, sort of aware of, I won't say complicity, but often like who sides with whom, what kind of deals and negotiations historically has been made, and so on, often kind of actually uh, points to that. I'll just give a quick example. I think a lot of my research has been, and I mean, I ended up making a zine on this because I precisely could not end up writing an essay on this, was actually to write a sort of think about the very messy sort of infrastructure logistics of doing opium trade in the Golden Triangle, right, during the Cold War era. And I think the Golden Triangle, just for people who might be unaware, is basically refers to this exchange point, literally a triangle between the borderlands of Laos, Burma, and Thailand. And it sort of refers to this sort of exchange of opium and later heroin or whatever that would kind of make the basic sort of would cut against the basic chains uh, for drug trade that would sort of be the mainstay of drug trade during the whole war. I mean, during the Cold War across the whole world in some way or the other. Um, and obviously had a lot to do with how lot to do with Cold War politics, lot to do with the history of the Vietnam War and things like that. But if one kind of is really acutely studying the sort of the history of the Golden Triangle, one becomes really aware, like it's very apparent. I'm not doing any extreme investigative research on this, but it's really quite aware of how like different, how basically shifting alliances shape the trade in some way or the other. So you could have like rebels often like often fighting against the Burmese state, could be siding up with the CIA in some way or the other, or the CIA would be funding the KMT, or like different ethnic minorities could be producing opium and selling it to either CIA or the other rebel groups, and so on and so forth. So I mean, it kind of, there's the good or bad, or really like a specific ugly in this game, but it's sort of like such a messy history of logistics in a way that everybody partakes in this sort of trade to kind of make do in a very precarious situation in the forest and so on. So I think it often comes down to kind of in the very nuts and bolts about the work we do and the kind of histories we write and the art we do, that it becomes really very apparent. Like often in our artwork, like we could be talking about beasts, shape-shifting beasts. We often write about beasts and bestiaries. We could often in the same artwork, we could often be talking in the same manner, talking about the Vietnam War. Often we could be talking about other things that happen in the forest and so on. So how we populate the forest literally is to kind of with whom we actually think about kind of cuts against, I think, this notion of Zomia as a sort of a romantic hideaway or getaway and so on. Like, just to be aware of the violences in the work that you do should be sufficient in and of itself as a method. Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah, that's really interesting. And this leads me to think about, of course, you've already spoken about the indisciplinary research that the forest curriculum engages in. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that concept to talk about the pedagogic channels through which the curriculum extends these speculations.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I think like one of the things that forest curriculum, just to give everyone a sort of actual things that we do and so on, I think one of the things that we are really interested in uh, as a sort of method or working practice is to actually make happenings possible, not in not in the 60s or 70s sense, but to actually gather people together to collectively think and do research and really often just have fun. I think that's really key. So I think one of the things that we really want to do is to keep our what we like to call research intensives going. So I mean, on 2019 we did a summer school in Bangkok, which was a 3-week thing, and we got like really people from all kinds of disciplines, both in terms of participants or speakers or whoever, to kind of have this 3-week long discussions and so on. And then we had a similar one in Los Baños as well, right before the pandemic hit. Los Baños is this very small town in town in the Philippines, right? I mean, in right off the boat in I mean right off, I mean it's not off the boat in Philippines. It right off the boat could actually mean right off the boat, but it just means a little on north on little north of Manila. And where we did, I mean, Los Baños is this one like small place which became a major sort of research hub for different empires that kind of colonized Philippines. So the Spanish, the American, Japanese, and later even the Marcos dictator regime, to kind of do all kinds of environmental experiments. So whether they could be like the later brutalist architecture that would later be replicated in Manila en masse, or like all these tropical research institutes or the agricultural research institutes, where a lot of working on or experimentations on how to govern and control tropical life was taking place in Los Baños, and then would be en masse set out onto the world. So we did a sort of workshops and intensives there as well. And then we've been doing a few things in the middle, but we're very frankly tired with that. A few things online as well. But then later this year we've been, last year, I mean the end of last year, we did some research intensives with or sort of workshops with students at the Royal Danish Academy for the Fine Arts, and then we're planning to put it again back into a longer format amongst ourselves in Philippines, and we're trying to work at it at this point. But obviously, gathering people together in the pandemic is a huge task in and of itself. But what I'd like to say is that what these intensive often do is that while we are doing workshops and while we are getting people to talk and while people are making zines and things like that, I think what really happens is that if you put people, energetic and vibrant and politically sensitive people in a room, I think a lot more comes off than you can actually go into the room thinking with. So I mean, often people who didn't work, what happens often in these is that people who often did not know each other previously, never worked on forest, never visited a forest, have then gone on to do artworks on this. Often participants gather together and publish in an by themselves. People work and research. People often ended up settling in Los Baños as well after the workshops and so on. So these could, we often like to think of these as outcomes at than like this, than like a very strict, like, oh, we got to publish this out of a book, or like this has to be an exhibition that comes of the research that we're doing together and things like that. So it could be a collective counter mapping exercise that we do. It could be a taxonomic exercise. People could be making extremely interesting zines, making music, hanging around, whatever, right? But the outcomes, I mean, in our own sort of anarchist way, we don't like to actually think of like a very standard like an academic book of a volume, or like an exhibition gallery that comes off as the sole sort of outcome. Anything could come of it. But we're doing a whole host of things now. We are thinking about curating a set of experimental publications. We're working with other artists to kind of think about different forms of public pedagogy and so on. So we are really onto a sort of whole host of things. But just to kind of clarify, unlike what forest curriculum does, is that because we are pretty much driven by research more than like, oh, we got to do this, we got to do that, like instead of specific outcomes. I think we like to kind of think about 3 or 4 on lines of research streams, and then like a text, a publication, a summer school event, or the summer school itself could be different manifestations of it. So instead of thinking of like the manifestation as our target goals, we'll kind of try to think of research streams and then take it along whoever we work with in whatever capacity they would want to join us and work with us and so on. Yeah.
Right, that's really interesting. The idea of bringing people together and working towards forms of engagement that do not necessarily have the certitude of a publication, like you said, but micro engagements that continue beyond the scope of the gathering itself. And that leads me to my next question. So in terms of praxis, the forest curriculum has been, as you have elaborated already, engaged in art activism and developing collective art-based thinking by bringing together plural voices from the global south. What qualifies as meaningful forms of collaboration and co-learning for the curriculum?
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing this question, because it really is a sort of thing that we are interested in. And just to kind of cap off from what you were saying, but just to kind of go to my previous answer, I think in terms of long-term engagement, that's really how we work. Like some people we met for the first time in like our summer school in 2019 in Bangkok. One of the participants actually hosted us for the workshop in Los Baños. He owns a space in Los Baños, and then we've gone on to collaborate and work with him on a zine, and then show with him in a different art space, and then work so on and so forth. So all our practice often weaves in and out, literally off, because we are trying to make do literally as our practice. So whoever we can make do, and not just in a sort of precarious sense, but also in terms of whoever we want to have fun with, often is actually how we collaborate. And it often really goes in these multi-channel weaving in and out format as well. And that's also just another sort of a quick identification for our practice. I think the way that we often sign off on our texts, any artwork we're doing, any gathering we're doing, is we write, and this is also how this interview would go on, is that we say, we don't say like Abhijan Toto and Pujita Guha as the forest curriculum, because we think that the forest curriculum is a large body of knowledge in some way or the other that we are collectively building. So how we like to sign off is Abhijan Gua, Pujita Gua, Abhijan Toto or Pujita Gua, whoever, I mean, could be anybody else as well. Pujita, for this, it would be like Pujita Gua for the forest curriculum, because we're both individual and part of a larger collective that we're signing off for. So anybody who likes to sign off with our name or this idea of the forest curriculum, we are very, very happy to have anybody on board, literally, because it is for this idea of the forest curriculum that matters to us more than just us signing off as like a rock band or something, as like having a common name and all 5 of us being put into that idea and so on. So it's something on that accord. And just to kind of think about what kinds of practices we've been doing and what constitutes for forms of knowledge across the global south. And I'll just give you one more quick example of the work we've been doing, and it sort of will, hopefully, kind of condense and make clear about our practice. So for the last year or so, we've been we have been on this research collaboration with, it's entirely been funded by the Australian Council. It's called To Catch a Bird with a Cloud, and it basically sort of, I wouldn't say pairs, but brings to dialogue Indigenous sovereignty rights activists from Australia, and Indigenous and ethnic minority activist rights and groups and artists from Southeast Asia. So they are very, very, very different historical and social contexts. But as one of our Australian counterparts, Joel Spring, who we love a lot, said that it's often solidarity without similarity. And that's sort of like, I mean, it's very t-shirt printable, but it's also like a slogan that we actually like to work with a lot. And I think what happened with To Catch a Bird with a Cloud is that amongst like a lot of the small outcomes that we've had in the research stream, but going forward hither and thither, uh, one of like the most joyous experiences that we've had is that one of our Filipino collaborators, Zeke Sales, who's a young activist. He's a geographer and a young activist who works often with urban planning. I mean, communities that counter urban planning or protest on work around urban planning, community kitchens, and so on. Very young guy, have this wonderful conversations with Laura Marna, who's a long-term collaborator of Joel's as well. They both, I mean, they run a podcast and so on, but they're Vishadri activists and so on. And I mean, Laura, I mean, this conversation across like Laura having similar anxieties and questions and angst often, not anxiety, angst often in terms of settler urbanism in Sydney or in Australia. Largely, and Zeke having these conversations from his grounded locality in Manila and its outskirts is like one of the most joyous experiences. Just listening to them talk, go back and forth 2 hours or 2.5 hours on like shared experiences of urban marginalization is actually often a very sort of concrete practice, or this moment of like this concrete uh, coming together of like global South solidarity that's often not just like flag bearing and things like that. Like literally solidarity without similarity kind of builds from like the people we want to get along, the people we engage with, and so on. So I mean, to kind of think about indigenous lands rights activism in Australia and indigenous lands right or food security activism in Southeast Asia are very different historical contexts, and Australia may not actually be global South in that traditional sense, but obviously global South means a degree of precarity wherever you are. So I guess like one of our research streams has been to kind of think about that. We've also had other activists from the Philippines. We've had like this group called Omehen from the Philippines, that is, and then we've also collaborated with Carlos, this sort of graphic designer and food rights activist from Indonesia, and so on. So we've kind of worked, and we're trying to work and come up with different things that would come off from that research initiative that we've had for a year. Uh, so we are obviously always trying to think about that. And I think what makes for global South solidarity is often just the ability to I mean, I like to say as ability to share similar humor, similar angst, and often just share similar lived realities in a way, right? I mean, they're not the exact same realities, but if your angst is at the right place, or if your humor is often at the right place, and you have faith often honestly in people, that often also comes through long-term research, right? So once you have that, all of that going, I think it becomes in and of a place of community building. It need not be so actively theorized as a place of global South and community formation, but I think it takes time to develop. And once you have that time, I think you can get that ball rolling as well. So I think we're now in the sort of second phase to catch a bird with a cloud, but we've already come up with like different forms of experimental forms of publication. We've often actually used the money to just actually give out money to indigenous communities for access to internet, like simply as basic as something as that is so important with the people, right? And I think like often people say, just to kind of end it off on a slightly different note, I think often when people say that, oh, art is something that's not really important, quote unquote, something that comes across when you're asking for funding and grants and things like that, that really nothing happens when two artists don't get money. But I think often the communities that we work with, or we often would want to work with, we'd like to think about the fact that if our communities don't get this art money, then a lot of their life actually comes to a halt and so on, right? And that actually speaks to the artists and the community's precarity in some way, that they depend on art for basic sustenance and basic activism going, and basic demands to food and right and so on, food rights and land rights and so on. So I think that the question of precarity and sustenance is very much built into who we think with as we're building along a project on the global South, and so on. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Pujita. That was a really like compact, intense conversation about like what the forest curriculum has been doing and the activities that it has engaged in itself in. Just one quick question. Do you have any projects coming up in the near future, or something that you're working on at the moment?
Good question. Yes, yes, yes. I mean, we have a lot of things always going ahead. I think, sorry, I mean, like both of us, both Abhijan and I, we have so much going on in our lives, and the forest is a chaotic space, and so is forest curriculum. We're not this intensive, to whoever's listening to us for the first time. We do have a lot going on. We are continuing with this sort of artistic project, artistic research project called How to Not Build a Nation, which is to kind of think about non-human assemblages as they pierce through nation-building histories in South and Southeast Asia. So we're trying to think of a video essay for now, a commissioned video essay for now. And also a different set of manifestation of that same project is this experimental publication that's coming out from a grant from Sharjah Arts Foundation. We have, what else do we have? We're trying to build a summer intensive for Philippines once again. And then we have like a lot of writing commitments and curatorial commitments here and there. We do have a lot spread out, but it always helps if you have good collaborators on board. Yeah.
Right. That's great. Looking forward to everything that you mentioned. And thanks so much for coming on board today for this conversation.